Imagine trying to cancel a multi-billion-dollar fighter jet order only to find out your own government already wired the manufacturer almost $500 million anyway.
I mean, it literally sounds like the inciting incident of a political thriller, but it's actually playing out in real life right now.
Yeah, it really is. So here's the situation on the ground. Peru recently committed $3.5 billion to buy 24 F-16 Block 70 fighter jets from the United States.
Which is just a massive upgrade for their military.
Oh, absolutely. But Peru's interim president, José María Balcazar, tried to abruptly stall the deal. He argued that, the country's treasury should really be focused on fixing social gaps instead of buying weapons.
Right, which the U.S. did not take well at all.
No, they didn't. In response, U.S. Ambassador Bernie Navarro issued this severe warning on X, formerly Twitter. He stated flat out that the Trump administration would use every available tool if Peru negotiated in bad faith.
And that's where things get really wild.
Exactly, because meanwhile, totally behind the president's back, the Peruvian Defense Ministry just went ahead and signed the paperwork anyway.
Wow.
Yeah, and the Finance Ministry quietly wired a $462 million down payment. When the dust settled, two top Peruvian ministers just up and quit in protest.
The internal friction there is just incredible. You have a head of state basically pulling the emergency brake, and his own ministries are they're just stepping on the gas.
It's like the ultimate reply-all disaster, but, with high-end military hardware. So welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to unpack this massive diplomatic collision.
Yeah, there's a lot to get into.
For sure. We'll look at the cutting-edge jets Peru actually bought, explore why their own government basically tore itself apart trying to stop the transaction, and talk about what this single incident reveals about a surprisingly aggressive new U.S. playbook that's rolling out across Latin America.
Well, to really grasp the scale of the political earthquake happening in Lima right now, we first need to look at the machines that caused it, right? Because the hardware itself really explains why the military establishment refused to let this deal die.
Right. So let's get into those specs. We're talking about an initial $2.0 billion phase for 12 Lockheed Martin F-16 Block 70 jets.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't just a routine swap of old planes for slightly newer ones. This marks Peru's return to American-made combat aircraft after, 45 years.
That's a huge gap. What were they flying before this?
So for nearly half a century, the Peruvian Air Force has relied on this incredibly disjointed mix of French and Russian technology.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they've been flying 1980s era French Mirage 2000s, 1990s era Russian MiG-29s, and Belarusian Su-27s. And honestly, most of those older planes are currently inoperative. They're literally just sitting in reserve.
I can't even imagine the logistical nightmare of maintaining that. I mean, it's like having a garage full of broken, completely incompatible classic cars.
That's exactly it.
You need parts from Moscow for one, parts from Paris for another. The manuals are all in different languages, and literally none of the diagnostic tools work together.
Yeah, it's a mess.
So upgrading to the Block 70 it's like trading all of that junk in for a fleet of brand new, fully networked smart cars. Does the tech upgrade this massive instantly change the balance of power down there, specifically with neighbors like Chile and Colombia?
Oh, absolutely. And taking that smart car analogy a step further, these jets fundamentally change how a pilot interacts with the battlefield.
Yeah.
I mean, the F-16 Block 70 is the most advanced production version of the aircraft ever built.
Right.
And the crown jewel of this jet is the ANAPG-83 AESA radar. So with older mechanical radars, the system physically moves a dish back and forth.
Okay.
It's essentially like sweeping a single narrow spotlight across a pitch-black sky. By the time the spotlight sweeps back around, your target might have moved.
Leaving you completely blind for crucial seconds.
Exactly. And the ESA radar, on the other hand, doesn't have moving parts. It uses hundreds of these tiny digital transmitter receivers. So it's like having hundreds of incredibly fast flashlights that can look in multiple directions at the exact same time.
That is wild.
Right. The pilot can track dozens of targets simultaneously in the air and on the ground at much greater distances without ever losing sight of any of them.
But, seeing the enemy first is really only half the battle. Surviving the airspace is just as important.
Very true. And that brings us to the Viper Shield electronic warfare system. Modern aerial combat is heavily dependent on invisible radio and radar waves.
Right. It's all electronic.
Exactly. So the Viper Shield creates this digital armor around the jet. It constantly scans the environment for enemy radar frequencies. If an enemy surface-to-air missile system tries to lock on to the F-16, the Viper Shield instantly identifies the threat, jams the signal, and deploys countermeasures.
So it basically blinds the enemy before they can even fire.
Precisely. And then there's the offensive capability, which is just a massive leap. They're getting AIM-120C8 AMRAAM missiles.
Okay, what makes those special?
Well, these are beyond visual range weapons, and the key feature here is that they're fire and forget. In the past, a pilot had to fire a missile and then physically keep the nose of their jet pointed directly at the target to guide the weapon all the way in.
Which basically makes the pilot a sitting duck.
Exactly. But with fire and forget technology, the missile has its own internal radar. The pilot locks on, fires the AMRAAM, and can immediately turn around and fly away at top speed while the missile just hunts down the target on its own.
Plus, I read the U.S. threw in a free KC-135R refueling tanker.
Yeah, they did.
And that completely changes the geography of what Peru can defend, right? Their jets don't even have to land to refuel. They can just stay in the air for hours and project power deep into the Pacific or over the Andes.
For sure. Factor in the 12,000-hour operational lifespan of these airframes and the intense training programs included, and Peru is closing a massive capability gap. Chile, for example, already operates a modern fleet. With this one purchase, Peru gets a sophisticated deterrent and plugs its military directly into secure, NATO-standard communication networks.
You're touching on the exact reason the Peruvian military establishment views this contract as just a total matter of existential national security. But the political establishment, they viewed it very differently. The timeline of how this deal fractured the government is fascinating.
It really is.
Wait, hold on, though. The timeline doesn't actually make sense to me. The outline of events shows interim President Balcazar abruptly canceling the official signing ceremony that was scheduled for April 17.
Right.
He goes on state television, points out there's a runoff election coming up on June 7, and says a transitional government has no business making a $3.5 billion commitment.
Yeah. He argued that the public funds should prioritize social gaps, health services, water access, things that affect everyday citizens.
Right. But then, literally just days later, the Treasury sends $500 million anyway. In most countries, the Treasury answers to the executive branch. How did a ministry legally bypass the interim president?
So that is the core of this whole crisis. The mechanism allowing the bureaucracy to bypass the president basically comes down to international contract law and the statutory mandates of the defense budget.
Okay.
You have to remember, Balcazar is Peru's 8th president in a decade.
Wow, 8th in a decade.
Yeah. The executive branch is historically very fragile, but the bureaucratic state, the career officials, they crave stability. By the time Balcazar went on television to stall the deal, the acquisition process had already crossed a legal point of no return.
Meaning the paperwork was too far along to just rip up.
Yes. When a state enters into a foreign military sales agreement with the U.S. government and a contractor like Lockheed Martin, there are strict penalty clauses.
Oh,
if Peru unilaterally breached the contract at the final hour, they would be dragged into international arbitration courts. They'd be legally forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in default penalties, and their sovereign credit rating would take a massive hit.
So they basically pay a fortune and get 0 airplanes in return.
Exactly. So the Ministry of Economy and Finance, along with the Ministry of Defense, they recognized that following the interim president's televised demands would essentially bankrupt the state's credibility. So they triggered the statutory mechanisms required to fulfill the contract, effectively just ignoring the executive order.
That is a staggering level of internal dysfunction. I mean, the local news broadcasts from Lima showed the presidential palace surrounded by press. It was total chaos.
Oh, yeah.
On April 20th, the Ministry of Defense executed a technical signing of the contract. Congress President Fernando Rospigliosi publicly backed the military, saying the deal was moving forward. And then on April 22, the Ministry of Economy quietly transferred that $462 million initial payment directly to Lockheed Martin.
The internal contradiction simply couldn't hold. I mean, a government cannot have its head of state shouting, "Stop!" while its treasury presses send.
No.
The fallout was immediate. On the exact same day the money was wired, Defense Minister Carlos Diaz and Foreign Minister Govt both resigned.
And they really made sure the door hit them on the way out. Dizallo went on local radio and outright accused the president of lying to the public.
Yeah, he didn't hold back.
He said the ministries tried to explain the financial ruin that would come from breaking the contract, but Balcazar chose political theater for the upcoming election over national credibility. And Diaz backed him up, warning that stalling compromised national security.
It forced a massive scramble, Amadeo Flores was immediately sworn in as the new defense minister to try and stop the bleeding.
Right.
The prime minister, Luis Arroyo Sanchez, he had to step in and release a formal statement to reassure the international community. He confirmed the purchase was a strategic necessity and admitted out loud that they had to fulfill the schedule to avoid those costly international penalties.
But while Peru's government is tearing itself apart, the U.S. response takes this from a local political scandal to a full-blown international incident.
Absolutely.
And this is where the Trump administration steps in. The U.S. Embassy in Peru releases a statement that reads like a strict lecture, emphasizing that, quote, there is a correct way to do serious, credible business, and warning that for a product of this caliber, there is no such thing as a small and inconsequential delay.
That statement alone is unusually blunt for diplomatic channels.
Yeah.
But then it escalated even further.
Right. U.S. Ambassador Bernie Navarro goes on X and posts that if Peru negotiates in bad faith, the Trump administration will use every available tool to protect U.S. and regional security.
Yeah.
Issuing a public threat on a social media platform over an allied nation's internal procurement debate feels incredibly aggressive. Is this normal diplomacy now, or is this a specific feature of the current U.S. playbook?
It is highly irregular. I mean, ambassadors generally operate behind closed doors precisely to avoid publicly embarrassing host nations. But issuing the threat on a public platform isn't a mistake. It's a calculated flex. The Trump administration is publicly signaling that they have zero tolerance for friction regarding strategic defense interests.
Oh.
By doing it in public, they're basically bypassing traditional diplomatic niceties and enforcing absolute alignment.
The U.S. risking massive diplomatic fallout over a few planes in Peru seems disproportionate on its face. But if we pull the camera back, Navarro's threats aren't a bug in the system. They are a feature of a much broader strategy to lock down the hemisphere.
That's the vital context here. This ironclad approach in Lima is really just one data point. We're seeing highly assertive hardball tactics from the U.S. playing out simultaneously across multiple Latin American countries right now.
It's less like a chess game and more like a corporate hostile takeover. The U.S. is aggressively buying up voting shares, whether that's defense reliance in Peru or resource extraction in other countries, so that when it comes time for the hemisphere to make decisions involving global competitors, the U.S. effectively owns the boardroom.
That corporate takeover metaphor actually fits perfectly when you look at Mexico right now.
Oh, for sure.
The U.S. Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, is deep into USMCA trade talks, and the U.S. is aggressively keeping tariffs on the table, specifically targeting auto, aluminum, and steel industries. They're making it crystal clear to Mexico that access to the massive U.S. consumer market comes with strict, non-negotiable conditions.
But the economic pressure in Mexico is almost nothing compared to the security crisis brewing there. This detail in the research just blew my mind. 2 CIA agents recently died in a car crash in the Mexican state of Chihuahua.
Yeah, that's a huge deal.
They were reportedly returning from a joint operation with local authorities to destroy a cartel drug laboratory.
And the fallout from that crash is immense, because Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum stated that a joint operation involving armed U.S. agents without federal permission is a blatant violation of national law.
Right.
She acknowledged that the military destroyed the lab, but explicitly claimed she was completely unaware U.S. intelligence agents were operating on the ground.
Let's just pause on that for a second. 2 foreign intelligence agents die in a car crash during an unauthorized military raid inside a sovereign neighbor's borders. That is an astonishing breach of sovereignty.
It really is.
If foreign operatives were running armed raids inside Texas without the U.S. president knowing, it would be an international crisis. It shows the U.S. is willing to operate aggressively on the ground, entirely bypassing the host nation's central government to achieve its security goals.
It definitely demonstrates a prioritization of immediate tactical results over diplomatic protocol. And we see that exact same aggressive prioritization when it comes to raw materials. Look at Chile. The U.S. just signed major critical minerals agreements with the Chilean government to secure investments in lithium and copper.
Because Chile is the world's largest copper producer and the second largest lithium producer.
Exactly. And those materials are the absolute foundation of the global energy transition. Every electric vehicle battery, every modern grid upgrade, they require vast amounts of lithium and copper.
And China's been eyeing that for a while.
Right. For the last decade, China's Belt and Road Initiative has been making massive inroads in South America, securing these supply chains. So the U.S. is now using its full diplomatic weight to forcefully counter that influence. ensuring American companies get priority access to the resources.
They're locking down the supply chains. And it's not just defense and mining, it's infrastructure and security, too. I saw the notes about Cuba and Haiti.
Yeah, so the State Department recently made a very rare visit to Havana. While pushing for economic reforms, they also offered to set up Starlink internet for free.
Which is interesting timing.
Very. The stated goal is to avoid a humanitarian disaster, but structurally, it introduces American-controlled communications infrastructure into a historically adversarial nation. And at the exact same time, the U.S. is heavily backing a United Nations gang suppression force that just arrived in Haiti. The U.S. is using its resources to force stability in Port-au-Prince ahead of their August elections.
When you lay it all out like that,
Uh,
forcing a fighter jet sale in Lima, playing tariff hardball and running unauthorized intelligence ops in Mexico, locking down lithium in Santiago, beaming internet into Havana, and backing armed forces in Haiti, the overarching strategy is super clear.
yeah, the Trump administration is utilizing maximum leverage everywhere, all at once. There is no gentle nudging anymore. It's an enforcement of hemispheric dominance.
It is a cohesive, aggressive doctrine. They're
Yeah.
using trade leverage, military sales, intelligence operations, and just raw public diplomatic pressure to shape the entire region to their strategic advantage. The Peruvian government collapsing over a few F-16s is just one highly visible flashpoint in this broader campaign.
Exactly.
So why does all of this matter to you listening right now? We often think of global politics as these neat, orderly agreements signed by unified nations at polished wooden tables. But this story shatters that illusion.
Oh, totally.
Modern geopolitics is incredibly messy. It moves at lightning speed. And it is deeply intertwined with billion-dollar defense contracts that can upend an entire country's political stability practically overnight. One day you're debating social spending on television, and the next day your foreign minister is resigning on the radio while $500 million vanishes from the treasury to pay for smart bombs.
The mechanics of how this happened in Peru really raises a fundamental question. And it's a provocative thought I want to leave with everyone listening. Think about the chain of events we just unpacked. What does it mean for the concept of democracy? When a country's military bureaucracy, bound by international corporate contracts, can completely bulldoze an elected leader's agenda.
That's the real question.
The president publicly said stop, and the state machinery simply ignored him and paid the bill anyway. When the legal mechanisms of defense spending can override the executive branch, who is really holding the steering wheel of this.
That is a heavy, pretty unsettling question. And it really brings us back to where we started. Next time you try to cancel a stressful order online, just be glad you don't have to worry about international arbitration courts, resigning ministers, and an ambassador threatening you on Twitter. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.